Welcome to Carlisle, a historic English city located just 10 miles south of the border with Scotland, boasting a history which stretches back more than 2,000 years. And on this walk around the city on a lively summer's afternoon, we'll discover everything from Carlisle's origins as the Roman settlement of Luguvalium to its magnificent medieval heritage. This city, home to one of England's smallest cathedrals, as well as a huge 900-year-old castle with an action-packed history. And as we make our way between the city's most famous landmarks, we'll also discover plenty more intriguing stories. As we stroll along Carlisle's great medieval city walls, learn the story of how the British government once took control of all of the city's pubs, venture through the remains of the Citadel, a huge Tudor-era fortress which seems like it was built on the wrong side of the city, and visit Carlisle's historic railway station, admiring both its magnificent exterior and the stunning glass roof which stands above the busy platforms within. All of that, and more, is to come over the next 35 minutes or so. But we begin our walk in the very heart of Carlisle, on the city's historic and lively Market Square. Amidst the hustle and bustle of this special summer market, there stands a collection of impressive historic landmarks, few more eye-catching than this, the Old Town Hall. Painted in a distinctive pink, Carlisle's Old Town Hall here was built just over 350 years ago in 1669 to host the local council, although nowadays the building houses a couple of cafes and the city's tourist information centre. If you're visiting Carlisle, this is a good place to learn about some lesser-known landmarks, one of which actually stands right outside the Old Town Hall here. You might notice a red postbox, a replica of Carlisle's very first postbox. But that's not all, because Carlisle's first postbox was actually the very first in all of mainland Britain. It was placed here 171 years ago in 1853, to be followed by what are now 115,000 postboxes standing on the nation's streets. That remarkable little landmark today shares the market square with the rather more prominent Market Cross just here, an original monument which has stood here ever since 1682. The cross, denoting where markets in the city have traditionally been held, is topped with a sundial and an intriguing sculpture of a lion, holding a copy of the city's historic charter, the document which gave Carlisle rights to hold markets, and more, back in 1352. Now, the markets held on this square for the last 7 centuries have been especially important. The stalls today give us a nice idea of what commerce might have been like in this city through time, with the exception of some more exotic foods, of course, because Carlisle is very much the centre of focus for a wide geographic region of the country. Taking a look at a map, Carlisle, as we mentioned, lies just 10 miles south of the border with Scotland, but perhaps more importantly is the only city in its county, Cumbria, a largely rural, sparsely populated, and unusually for England, mountainous county. For this reason, at a Carlisle market you could find pretty much anything, whether that be agricultural produce from the English countryside, fish from the waters of the Irish Sea, or even goods from across the border in Scotland. It's fair to say then that market trade was big business in the Carlisle of yesteryear. And here, just around the back of the Old Town Hall, there stands an even older building which overlooked the city's bustling commercial sphere. This is the old Guildhall, a fetching timber-framed medieval building that was built more than 600 years ago, in 1407. It's one of the city's oldest buildings of all, and as the name suggests, this was where the guilds of Carlisle once met, 8 influential groups of merchants who coordinated different local industries, and inside there was a meeting room for each of them. One for the city's butchers, one for its shoemakers, and one each for local weavers, merchants, skinners, tanners, smiths, and tailors. Now, these men played a big part in the busy commerce which unfolded in Carlisle, But just a few doors away here, there stands another important landmark of the market square, the iconic Crown and Mitre Hotel. Built in 1905, this huge Edwardian-era hotel is actually a rebuild of a much older coaching inn, a tavern which began life more than 300 years ago, and which served as the place where people would arrive, stay overnight, and then depart from on long-distance stagecoach journeys to destinations like London, Glasgow and Edinburgh. Now one of Carlisle's most prestigious hotels, the Crown and Mitre has also hosted many famous faces through the years, including the acclaimed Scottish author Walter Scott on the night before his wedding, as well as Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, in 1918, when he visited Carlisle, the city of his mother's birth. Surrounding the market square, though, are plenty more historic inns. The King's Head here, for instance, dating from the 17th century, although local legend has it that ale has been on sale here for more than 1,000 years, since the 10th century. That would actually make the King's Head Carlisle's oldest pub, though that's no surprise here on the narrow Fisher Street, one of the city's oldest streets of all, linking the market square with the place where most of Carlisle's historic trade takes place today, inside the city's huge market hall. Built over 3 years from 1887 to 1889, this grand brick-built hall is one of just a handful of covered Victorian market halls still in use in Britain today. And it's home to a mix of modern shops on one side of the hall, as we can see here, and traditional market stalls on the other side. But it's not just trade that has been conducted beneath the market hall's Victorian roof. Through the years, this building has also been used as a local concert venue. Famous acts including AC/DC, The Who, Thin Lizzy and many more have actually played gigs inside Carlisle's market hall, right in the heart of this historic city centre. In fact, pretty much wherever you find yourself in central Carlisle, there's centuries, and in some cases millennia of history to be discovered. Fisher Street, for instance, was once upon a time the site of a Roman house, built just under 2,000 years ago, when this city existed as a strategic Roman stronghold. Now, Carlisle's history does actually stretch back to long before the Romans arrived. Once upon a time, this was one of the strongest towns inhabited by native Celtic Britons, although it's said that this settlement was likely burned to the ground when the Romans rolled into town in the second half of the 1st century AD. From that point on, the city grew and grew, and long after the Roman era, there came a medieval heyday, during which time some of Carlisle's most iconic landmarks were built, few more famous than the city's cathedral, which we find just here. Carlisle's cathedral is well known as one of the smallest in England, but it's also one of the most beautiful, unusually boasting one of the country's largest cathedral windows, here at the eastern end, a gorgeous addition to a building with the best part of 900 years of history under its belt. Carlisle Cathedral actually began life as a monastery church, established all the way back in the year 1122. But just 11 years later, in 1133, it was quickly elevated to the status of a cathedral by King Henry I. The king did this as a show of power in the often unruly borderlands between England and Scotland. The presence of a cathedral in the very northern reaches of his kingdom was a clear symbol of his authority, and intended to serve as a deterrent to any would-be raids or attacks from north of the border. But it wasn't just politics. Worship remained a key part of life here at the cathedral, and just here we find the remains of what were once the cathedral cloisters, part of the original medieval monastery which enclosed monks from the rest of the city, allowing them to focus undisturbed on prayer and religious study. The monastic community existed here at the heart of Carlisle for around 4 centuries, as the cathedral building beside them gradually grew in size. It was even rebuilt in the late 13th century into roughly the shape that we see today. Recognisable for its striking red sandstone, the current cathedral has weathered plenty of storms through Carlisle's history. During the English Civil War, part of the building was actually demolished so that the stone could be used to reinforce the city's castle. Meanwhile, during the major Jacobite rebellions of the 18th century, this cathedral was even briefly used to hold a number of the rebels prisoner. But not all of this historic place of worship managed to survive through the centuries. Just here, beside the main cathedral, we see a building known as the Fratry, originally a dining hall which was part of the monastery, and one of the few remains of a monastery which was largely destroyed about 500 years ago when King Henry VIII's infamous dissolution of the monastery's campaign set its sights on Carlisle here. As we can see, the cathedral itself was thankfully spared, and it went on to write many more stories. In fact, on that note, the famous Scottish author, Sir Walter Scott, was married here back in 1797, after he stayed at the Crown and Mitre Hotel the previous evening. Today, Carlisle Cathedral is an unmistakable symbol of this city, situated among tranquil grounds surrounded by a beautiful collection of historic buildings, such as the 15th and 16th century Prior's Tower and Deanery just here, a couple more remnants of the old monastery. But there is of course much more to see in Carlisle than the grounds of its gorgeous cathedral, so let's make our way out by way of the Abbey Gate just here, which was built in 1528 during an extensive but rather ill-timed renovation of the monastery, just a few years before it was dissolved by Henry VIII. On leaving its grounds, we can see just how the walls separated the monastery from the streets of Carlisle, which would have been lively with business and activity, while monks prayed just feet away. Here we find ourselves on a fetching cobbled street known as Paternoster Row, which today offers some lovely views of the cathedral from another angle, but where we can also turn our attention away from the grand religious building at the heart of the city, as it's obscured by the trees. The city of Carlisle may have thousands of years of history to speak of, but there have been some curious developments here in the last couple of centuries or so, one of which unfolded inside the city's many pubs. Now, on the corner of Paternoster Row up ahead is a large mid-18th century pub named the Boardroom, a pub which takes its name from the fact that it stands opposite what were once upon a time the head offices of an organisation named the State Management Control Board, who for almost 60 years in the mid-20th century ran an unusual experiment in Carlisle's pubs. Known as the State Management Scheme, between 1916 and 1973, the British government decided to nationalise all of Carlisle's pubs. The scheme started out during the First World War, as an effort to reduce drunkenness among munitions factory workers from the nearby town of Gretna, who would often come flooding into Carlisle after a hard day's work. As we pass by the city's famous Tullie house, currently under refurbishment and which we'll talk more about a little later on, the state management scheme allowed the government to restrict the sale of alcohol in Carlisle's pubs in order to reduce the impact of drunk and disorderly behaviour on the war effort. And it was such a success in achieving its goals that after the war ended, the government decided to keep running the scheme here for 55 more years. During that time, many of Carlisle's pubs were designed to promote entertainment and the sale of food over alcohol, slightly influencing the modern-day gastropubs that exist well beyond the scheme's eventual abolition in the early 1970s. Who knows how such a scheme would go down today in Carlisle, or anywhere else in Britain for that matter. But what we do know is that we've now reached the top of Castle Street, a street whose name, understandably, comes from the historic building that we can see just across the road, Carlisle Castle. Now, as we wait for the lights to change, it's important to know that Carlisle Castle has been the centrepiece of this city's history for nearly 2,000 years, beginning its life all the way back in the Roman era. The Roman Empire launched its conquest of Britain in the year AD 43, initially landing on the island's south coast, around 300 miles away from Carlisle. By AD 72, they had advanced far north, and on reaching this region, they established a small fort on this very site. But that's not the castle which we see in front of us here.
In fact, the remains of the Roman-era fortress are today buried beneath the mighty walls of the medieval Carlisle Castle. This imposing castle, first built just over 900 years ago, in the year 1122. You might remember that that was around the same time as the cathedral, and similarly, this stone castle was commissioned on the orders of King Henry I, who sought a grand fortress to cement his authority in this distant corner of his kingdom, and to secure the border against incursions and invasions from Scotland, just a few miles further north. And through the centuries, this castle has served that very purpose time and time again. But you wouldn't know its action-packed history simply from looking at its almost immaculately preserved remains. In front of us here are some of the earliest surviving parts of the castle, the striking main gate straddling the moat, and just beyond it, inside the walls, the castle keep, the central and most fiercely defended part of the fortress. The keep was added to the castle a couple of decades after it began construction, and although very well preserved, not all of it remains today. Once upon a time, in fact, it would have been much taller, providing a better vantage point over the surrounding area. This was crucial for the defence of Carlisle, because this city was almost constantly caught in the crosshairs of medieval Anglo-Scottish conflict. In fact, between 1173 and 1461, the Scots laid siege to Carlisle and its castle no less than 7 times. In later years, the borderlands became increasingly lawless, and Carlisle Castle here was one of the few bastions of strength in the face of so-called border reivers, parties of raiders who would cross the border, in both directions, to rob and pillage every town, village and person that they encountered. But that's not even the half of Carlisle Castle's story. In the mid-16th century, Mary Queen of Scots resided here for a few weeks after fleeing a rebellion against her in Scotland. In the mid-17th century, during the English Civil War, Carlisle Castle was a stronghold for the Royalists supporting King Charles I, and one of his few northern strongholds throughout the war, although it eventually fell to the parliamentarians in 1645 after a gruelling 9-month-long siege. But as we now make our way back across the busy main road here, the story of Carlisle Castle is nothing without a mention of the events of 1745, when this fortress became the very last English castle to undergo a siege. This 5-day siege came during the Jacobite Rising of 1745, when Carlisle Castle was attacked and captured by Jacobite forces seeking to restore the old Stuart dynasty to the British throne. Composed mostly of Scots, the Jacobites' capture of Carlisle here was the first step of an invasion which pushed deep into England. In fact, they made it all the way down to Derby in the Midlands, but were then forced to retreat all the way back to Scotland, eventually suffering total defeat by the British government at the Battle of Culloden near Inverness in 1746. The Jacobite Rising was the last military engagement here in Carlisle, a city which had been involved in war ever since the Romans first arrived, when they established a fort in the middle of what would become the city of Luguvalium. Now, once upon a time, Luguvalium was one of the most strategically important Roman strongholds in Britain. It also held the title of the most northerly city in the empire, situated more than 1,000 miles northwest of Rome itself. Fundamentally, the fort here served not only to confirm Roman authority over the native Britons of the region, but also to act as a staging post for early Roman invasions into Scotland, and later as a point of support for soldiers manning Hadrian's Wall. Indeed, Hadrian's Wall ran just a stone's throw to the north of central Carlisle, and Luguvalium was one of the most prosperous cities along the route of the historic frontier, existing not just as a military base, but a civilian settlement as well. Not only was Luguvalium strategically valuable for its position close to Scotland, but it also stood on an important crossroads, where trade travelled in and out by way of Roman roads and rivers that flow out into the Irish Sea. For this reason, people settled around the outskirts of the Roman fort, many of whom were members of the Carvetti tribe, native Celts who developed early industry and trade in Carlisle during the Roman era. But today, little can be seen of this Roman settlement in Carlisle, much of Luguvalium now buried beneath the streets of the modern city. Later on, we'll talk more about the story of how Luguvalium became Carlisle as we know it today. But for now, we've made our way away from the castle and onto the delightful cobbles of Abbey Street. Leading towards the Abbey Gate that we made our way through earlier when leaving the cathedral grounds, Abbey Street is one of Carlisle's most fetching lanes, lined by an array of colourful buildings from a variety of different eras. That includes the elegant Herbert Atkinson house here, a late Georgian-era townhouse of the 18th century, as well as its slightly larger neighbour next door, a Victorian-era extension to Carlisle's famous Tullie house, today a museum and another of the city's most popular attractions. We briefly mentioned the Tullie house a few minutes ago when we passed by its scaffolded facade on Castle Street, currently under refurbishment. But it's worth more than just a passing reference, because the Tullie house is probably one of the best places to get up close and personal with Carlisle's illustrious history. Surrounded by some gorgeous gardens, Tullie started out life as an early 17th century mansion, but the house was later converted into a museum in 1893, and over time it's grown into Carlisle's main cultural centre. Today, the Tullie House Museum hosts exhibitions on everything from local history, displaying relics from Roman Luguvalium, the medieval city, and more, to gallery exhibitions showcasing world-famous artworks, numbering among more than 1 million items of historic and cultural significance under the museum's care. It's an excellent local institution that goes a long way to showing Carlisle's rich heritage. But as we pass by the Abbey Gate once again, we're now going to make our way towards another of this city's most magnificent historic landmarks. With a wealth of Roman heritage, a majestic cathedral, a mighty medieval castle and more, Carlisle has all the trappings of a true cradle of history. But there's one more thing that all great historic English cities have: walls. Once upon a time fully surrounded by defensive fortifications, the walls of Carlisle today remain very well preserved in places, particularly here on the western side of the city. Now originally the Romans built a series of wooden defences around the city of Luguvalium, but these were later replaced by large stone walls in the medieval era, and those are the walls which we can see here, still standing around 9 centuries after they were first built. Granted, through all the action of the many sieges and attacks on Carlisle over time, these walls have been extensively rebuilt time and time again. So within the walls that we're looking at here, you'll find stones from as early as the 12th century and as recently as the 1980s, when important restoration work was carried out to ensure the survival of these valuable fortifications. When they were a complete circuit, the walls of Carlisle ran for just under 1.5 miles, one of the longer sets of city walls in England. And while you can't complete a full lap of the city anymore, you can still walk along the top of the defences in parts today, following in the footsteps of the people who defended this city from outside attack centuries ago. Here on top of the well-preserved west walls, buildings of Carlisle's first monastery stand proud, this being the Prior's Tower of the 15th century, which doubled as part of the religious community at the heart of the city, and as a useful lookout atop the defences, which could be used to warn of any incoming attacks from the west. Assaults on Carlisle came from all directions through the centuries, but from the very beginning the main threat was from Scotland to the north. For that reason, the castle stood on the northern side of the walled town, in the same positions as the Romans had built their fort back in the late 1st century. But while the prosperous city of Luguvalium developed on the outskirts of the Roman fort, it didn't last forever. In the late 4th century, the Romans abandoned Carlisle entirely, and the city once again came under the control of native Britons, specifically as the capital of the small kingdom of Rheged, an early precursor to what would become the modern county of Cumbria. The people of this kingdom spoke a local language known as Cumbric, whose closest relative in the modern day is actually the Welsh language. And in fact, the city of Carlisle's modern name even features a word still found in Welsh. The Car at the beginning of Carlisle derives from the word Caer, meaning fortress, which is also found in the likes of Cardiff, Carmarthen, Carnarvon, and more. Carlisle very simply means the fort of Luguvalium, and that Roman name, Luguvalium, likely refers to a Celtic god, Lugus, who was worshipped by the natives of this region around 2,000 years ago. Over time, local pagan religions were replaced by Christianity here in Carlisle, and just here we find an interesting building associated with the city's historic monasteries, the 15th century Tithe barn. Built in the 1470s, this barn was the place where the church stored tithes, a form of rent that was paid by local people to the church in the form of agricultural produce from their own homes. At the time, this was typically more useful than simply paying in cash, but agricultural goods of course required somewhere to be stored. And as we can see from the length of this historic tithe barn, the church in Carlisle was raking in quite a significant amount of rent for decades. Eventually the barn ceased to be used for storing tithes after Henry VIII dissolved the monastery, but it's since been well restored, and more than 500 years after it was built, now serves as a church hall for the neighbouring Church of St Cuthbert, which stands among the trees in this tranquil corner of the city centre. Opposite the churchyard is the Sportsman Inn, another historic city pub which can trace its origins back around 300 years to the early 18th century, when it was built on a site once occupied by another local monastery, known as the Blackfriars Convent. At the peak of the medieval city, there were actually 3 separate monasteries, all located close to one another in this deeply religious part of Carlisle, where we now find St Cuthbert's Church, a hidden gem of the city centre, which is much, much older than it seems at first glance. The current church was built back in 1778, but it's actually the 4th church to have stood on this spot. The original St Cuthbert's is actually thought to have been built more than 1,300 years ago in the late 7th century AD. Back then, it was likely a small wooden church in the heart of the Celtic city, but nothing remains of it, nor its 2 successors. In fact, only a 14th century stained glass window inside the current church is all that remains of the pre-Georgian era buildings. Before the current church was built, though, St Cuthbert's held an unusual title. For a brief period in the 1640s, it was the only church in this city. Following the parliamentarians' capture of Carlisle after the vicious siege of 1645, Oliver Cromwell ordered the closure of the city's historic cathedral, and in its place, St Cuthbert's here became Carlisle's civic church, the place where local people could worship. Now, even though the cathedral has been very much open for prayer for centuries, St Cuthbert's actually still remains the civic church of Carlisle, and it also lends its name to this alleyway we're walking down now, St Cuthbert's Lane. Once upon a time, this one lane was home to as many as 4 separate pubs, the very last of which closed just after the state management scheme began. But today, St Cuthbert's Lane is best distinguished by this archway up above, which straddles the entrance to the lane from the busy pavement of the Market Square. The Market Square is of course where we began our walk just under half an hour ago. But while we may have come full circle, we haven't quite finished our tour of Carlisle, because there are plenty more things to see in this city, particularly on the southern edge of the historic walled town. So from here, we're now going to head southwards along the wide open English Street here, nowadays the city's main shopping street, but with plenty more history than just the high street chains flanking us on either side. Once upon a time, this was part of the main Roman road leading from the south towards the fort. But over the centuries, this busy thoroughfare evolved into an important place of commerce, as Carlisle developed into a bustling industrial city. Now lined by a mix of 19th and 20th century buildings, English Street also plays host to a statue of none other than James Steele, the mayor of Carlisle for 2 years back in the 1840s. Steele was an especially influential figure in the industrial era city, not only in his political career, but also in his earlier role as a newspaper editor of the Carlisle Journal, no less, the city's first and most popular newspaper of the day. The journal's first issue was published in 1798, at the beginning of a period when this historic medieval city was becoming a major centre of modern industry, and whose population was beginning to swell in tow. In 1801, around 10,000 people lived in Carlisle, yet by 1901, a century later, that number had risen to more than 45,000, driven by fast industrial growth that revolved mainly around local textile mills. Tens of mills built around the city employed thousands of people, who were coming to Carlisle faster than they could be housed. Like many historic cities turned centres of industry at the time, Carlisle suffered from dramatic overpopulation in the early 19th century. At worst, there was only one home for every 5 people in this city. And in practice, this meant swathes of workers who'd moved into Carlisle from the Cumbrian countryside were forced to live in all manner of makeshift shelters, including local slaughterhouses and barns, where basic sanitation was almost non-existent. It took the best part of 100 years for the city to build enough houses to cope with its growing population, and today Carlisle is home to around 100,000 people, living in what is the largest urban area in Cumbria, surrounding the comparatively tiny historic city centre. Now, the historic centre is marked by the boundaries of the old walls, and just here we're coming up on the southern edge of the defences, which in the mid-16th century became the home of a brand new fortress for the city. Originally, this was the site of the medieval Botcher Gate, Carlisle's main southern gateway. But in 1541, under the orders of King Henry VIII, it was replaced by a new fortress to be known as the Citadel, which would bolster the defence of Carlisle in the aftermath of the king's controversial dissolution of the monasteries. Built on a grand scale with beefy defences, the Citadel here certainly looks the part of a mighty early modern fortress. And it was badly needed too. It was said that by the time the Citadel was completed, the defences over at Carlisle Castle had been reduced to just one old gunner, not quite enough to fight off another Scottish siege. But of course, attacks by the Scots typically came from the north, yet the Citadel here stands protecting the southern side of Carlisle. This might seem like an oversight, but during construction the gun emplacements in this fortress were built to face northwards, that is towards Scotland, but also directly over the city of Carlisle itself. It's said that this served as a clear message from the king, that he would rather see Carlisle, such a strategically valuable city, destroyed entirely, rather than have it fall into the hands of the Scots. In any case, the Citadel's time as a fortress was actually rather short-lived. In 1611, just 70 years after it was built, it was closed and converted into a prison, and then the city's Crown Court a couple of centuries later. The courts moved out in the 1990s, with the towers of the Citadel used for a number of different purposes in the years since. But after a recent restoration, this historic fortress stands as an impressive welcome to visitors approaching Carlisle from the south. And if you're keen to learn more, you can actually take tours of the inside of the Citadel's West Tower, home to old jail cells and courtrooms. But all of a sudden, we find ourselves outside the historic walled town, which we've spent most of our walk exploring. But even here on the edge of Carlisle's centuries-old nucleus, there are some truly splendid buildings. Few more splendid, in fact, than the city's absolutely magnificent railway station just up ahead. Throughout history, we know that Carlisle has stood at a crucial crossroads in northwest England, strategically important both for military reasons and for trade. And so it's no surprise that when the railways began to spread across Britain, this city became a major stop on the network, with a gorgeous station building to really drive home its significance. This elegant station building was completed in 1848, 1 year after the station actually opened, originally under the name Carlisle Citadel, for the building just beside. The station was a big undertaking, but it was done for 2 separate railway companies, the Lancaster and Carlisle Railway, who ran the line down to Lancaster, and Caledonian Railways, who ran the fast-growing train network in central Scotland. Carlisle here was therefore an important interchange which linked multiple railway networks together, through an otherwise sparsely populated part of Britain. And over time it became a crucial stop on long-distance train journeys, beginning as far south as London and heading up towards Glasgow and Edinburgh. To this day, if you're taking the train along the length of Britain's West Coast main line, you'll stop here in Carlisle, and be treated to the gorgeous station architecture, with the platforms covered by a magnificent Victorian glass roof. This is the perfect place to roll into Carlisle and begin your visit to this riveting city. But sadly, it's also the place where our walk around Carlisle has reached its end. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now eagerly looking forward to making your own trip to Carlisle sometime soon.